Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Few eras of theater history get as much attention as early modern English drama, especially because of its association with William Shakespeare. There's no shortage of work from this time period to analyze, but it's only a fraction of what Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights actually wrote. As our guest today notes, recent estimates suggest that for the period of circa 1567 to 1642, whilst only 543 plays from the London commercial theatres have survived, as many as 744 plays are identifiably lost, with hundreds more completely untraceable. We obviously can't say for sure what all of these lost plays were about, but what might they tell us about the plays that did survive? That's one of the questions that today's guest, Dr. David McInnis, explores in his book, Shakespeare and Lost Plays, Reimagining Drama in Early Modern England. Dr. McInnis is an associate professor of Shakespeare and early modern drama at the University of Melbourne in Australia. He's also the founder and co-editor of the Lost Plays database, an online forum for scholars to share information about the lost plays of early modern England. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
How did these plays get lost? Is it just a matter of the theater companies at the time saved all the good ones, made sure that they printed them, and threw out the bad ones?
It's not quite so simple as that, but that's one of the reasons why the study of lost plays has been largely neglected until quite recently. A number of scholars have, with a slight element of wishful thinking, just wanted to assume that the best naturally survived and that the worst perished because they were neglected or ignored. And it's not that straightforward. One of the things I want to do in this book, and one of the things I've been doing in my work over the last decade or so, is trying to complicate that narrative a little bit and think about the various reasons why things become lost, and then how to cope with that loss in terms of our scholarship and the work we do on this rich period. So some of these plays were lost because they just simply never saw fit to be printed. The companies owned the plays sometimes, other times actors owned the plays, other times the playwright retained control. It's never a very straightforward matter of ownership. And especially in the case of plays that were collaboratively written by a number of playwrights or transferred between companies, or for various other reasons, just it was more complicated to get things into print. They may have been a perfectly functional play on stage and may even have earned quite a lot of money for a company, but didn't translate into print success necessarily. So there were a few different reasons these plays would become lost. Sometimes it was pure accident. The Cockpit Playhouse was vandalized in 1617 during apprentice riots, and that resulted in the loss of a number of play texts stored at that venue. The Fortune Playhouse burned down in 1621, taking a good deal of its stock with it as well. Some plays were a bit too controversial. Some were censored. Most notoriously, Ben Jonson and Thomas Nash had a play called The Isle of Dogs, and we don't entirely know what that was about, but it caused significant offence, and the authorities threatened to pluck down all the theatres in London in response to this seditious play being performed. So there's a whole variety of different reasons. If you look at Shakespeare as a really easy example, most people, I think, are aware that about half of Shakespeare's plays weren't printed during his lifetime. They weren't printed until 7 years after his death in the book we now call the First Folio. But we wouldn't cast aspersions over the quality of Shakespeare's plays. So just because there's a dozen or more plays that weren't printed during, doesn't mean they were bad plays. So it's complicated. It's not so simple as just the good ones survive and were instantly printed.
So if these plays are lost, how do you study them?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think, again, we've seen some interesting developments in theatre history scholarship in particular in the last decade or more, as it's really distinguished itself from literary criticism. And literary criticism, and literary history for that matter, has throughout the 20th century really been predicated on this notion of close reading. You know, the Leaversite or Russian formalist approach to scholarship that involved close reading of texts. And obviously that's not possible where the play text has been lost. So that's a pretty significant hindrance to the study of lost plays and has retarded the growth of that field, I guess. It's prevented people from studying them in many ways. And what we're seeing now is a greater interest, I think, into how this commercial marketplace in which Shakespeare was operating, the theatrical marketplace of early modern London, operated. The ways that companies chose to acquire certain plays at certain points in time in relation to what other companies were doing. So thinking about Shakespeare not just as some artistic genius, but a man who was a shareholder in his own company. He had a vested interest in making money, and he would supply his company with scripts, as would other playwrights, but they were all doing so with a view to box office success and trying to get people in through the doors and paying their admission prices. So if we move away from close reading and instead think about the commerce of playing and playgoing, and start thinking about the kinds of plays in terms of genre and subject matter and popularity even that companies acquired, we can do a lot more with lost plays. Sometimes we have just a fragment of a lost play that survived, a couple of pages maybe. Sometimes we have a diary account or a reference to someone having seen it in performance. Other times there'll be legal records, like from the Star Chamber, or there might be publication records in terms of a registration at Stationers' Hall, your intention to publish. And all these things just give us little glimpses, little snippets of knowledge about the topics, the subject matters of lost plays, which helps us get this richer picture of how everything sort of interrelates, I guess. It's a big jigsaw puzzle, really.
You just gave some examples there of kind of how we at least know that there is a play that was lost. There's one kind of interesting case that I know might sort of tell us a little bit more about the larger subject. And you talk about it in your book. It's a play called Hester and Ahasuerus, which kind of sounds like it's semi-lost. We don't have an English language version, but we apparently, you say we have a German language translation of the lost English play. Is that right?
Yeah, this is another really fascinating example of where there's just been this gap in scholarship for a while. So in the 19th century, German scholars in particular were all over this, but the Anglophone world didn't really have much knowledge. And then, of course, we have the World Wars in the 20th century, and we have a falling off of the German scholarship and its interest in Elizabethan England. And this huge swathes of knowledge were just lost by the English-speaking world, I suppose, and haven't really been picked up until more recently. But basically what happens with this Hester play is that, during the 1580s and 1590s, English players and playing companies toured the continent. They often went to Germany and Austria, to the Low Countries, up through Poland, even into Scandinavia as well. In the 1580s, they tended to perform English versions of the plays still, often quite short, abbreviated versions for a non-English speaking audience. By the 1590s, the players were a bit more comfortable with the touring circuit on the continent, and they were starting to translate those English plays into local languages. And a volume of English plays, specifically English plays, translated into German, was published in Leipzig in 1620. There's about a dozen plays in this volume. And again, 19th century German scholars knew quite a lot about this, but English-speaking scholars didn't really, and the interest has only started to be revived recently. So the Hester play that's preserved in German there seems to be a German redaction, I'll call it, an appropriation and an adaptation. It's much shorter than an English play ordinarily would be, of a play that was performed by Shakespeare's company in 1594. And so for me, this is really fascinating, A, because we have a whole play. We just don't have any of the English words from it. And the translation is very much a working translation into German. It's pretty rough and just for performance. It's not poetic. It's not beautiful. But we do have the whole play. So we know exactly what happens. We know all the characters. We know the dramaturgy, all those sorts of things. And if we translate it back into English, we can start finding out some interesting things about it if you don't speak German, as I don't. And you can start to see how it related to other plays being offered at the time. So for me, this Hester play is particularly interesting because in June 1594, over an 11-day period, from the 3rd of June to the 13th of June, Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, really first appears in the archival records. It appears in conjunction with another company called the Lord Admiral's Men, and they're both performing at an irregular venue, somewhere called Newington Butts, which is a bit outside of London City as such, so it's a bit less populous. And one theory is they were recovering from recent plague and they didn't want to perform somewhere that was too densely populated and too crowded, which is something I think we can all associate with at the moment. And the other theory that Laurie Johnson and others have floated is that there were severe weather events that year as well, extreme flooding. So all those playhouses on the south bank of the Thames were essentially unusable, whereas Newington Butts had an elevated position, and so it was safer to perform there. So for 11 days, these two companies in some weird way were performing in conjunction or in collaboration, and the Hester play was performed there twice. And up until now, scholars have insisted that it was an interesting play only because it's the sole example of Shakespeare's company apparently having a biblical play in their repertory, which is not something that's otherwise attested to. If we look at the German version, we can find out a lot more about this play and how it relates in different ways to the other plays being offered at the time, which I think is super fascinating.
Yeah, even for the plays that we really don't know anything about, we don't have a German version of them or anything. You really show in the book how you can still look at what we do know about those plays, and it really affects our understanding of the context in which Shakespeare's plays were performed. Could you maybe give us a few examples of how you've been looking at these lost works and sort of seeing some of Shakespeare's better known plays in a new light?
So the thing that's really helpful here is this is quite unlike. There are other fields that are characterized by loss. Our colleagues in the classics, in particular, most of their work is lost, and it's phenomenal the kind of work classicists can do with the surviving literature from their periods. Right? We have a bit of a safety net here, in as much as this commercial context offers us a very easy way of understanding how these plays fitted together. The marketplace was highly responsive. It's a bit like commercial television or like Hollywood studios. They always have an eye on what the competitor is offering. They're trying to preempt or to get in there first with their new offering that is going to capitalize on current demands from the audience, or they'll build on previous successes. So it's very sensitive, very responsive, I suppose. And so one of the things that's quite useful here in this context of, and my book focuses on London specifically. I have worked on lost plays from elsewhere in England as well, but the London context is where that commercial imperative is so apparent. It makes it much easier to work with the fragmentary archival record, I suppose. So to give you one example, because playgoers would go repeatedly to performances, right? But plays are being performed at multiple venues across London, 6 days a week by a variety of companies. It was the single largest form of entertainment. So if you have a playgoer coming along to your recent play, it's a safe bet they've been to a few other plays as well recently. And they know what the competition is doing. They know what you've been performing recently also. So it is, to invoke the literary studies metaphor, it's a kind of intertextuality. There's a case of seeing those references, those cross-references, those allusions, and sometimes there'd be visual allusions, not just textual allusions and echoes. So you'd see recreated scenes or familiar patterns or character types being repeated across plays. And so the example I love giving is Shakespeare's Henry V, which is a play that we now fondly remember as a very patriotic play about war and nationalism and these stirring motivational speeches. And right bang in the middle of Henry V is this scene with Catherine, his future bride, the French princess. And at the very end of Shakespeare's Henry V, we see Henry attempting to woo Catherine, and we know that later on they're going to go on to become married. And those two scenes in particular just seem a little bit odd, given the military context of the rest of the play. So what struck me as fascinating is that when you look at what Shakespeare's most immediate rival company, the Admiral's Men, I say most immediate rivals because at this point, at the turn of the century, the Admiral's Men were at the Rose Playhouse, which is literally across the road from the Globe. So you see Shakespeare's Henry V being performed at the Globe. Across the road at the Rose, the Admiral's Men choose to respond by performing a now lost play called Owen Tudor. And Owen was Princess Catherine's second husband. So rather than responding with a comparable war play, they decided to focus on Catherine as the central part of Shakespeare's play, literally the central part of Shakespeare's play, and the one who has the final words in Shakespeare's play, and to tell her further adventures, if you like, what life was like for her with her second husband subsequently. And it seems to have been a romance, a love story, rather than anything to do with military and fighting. So really interesting in that it makes you reconsider what's most important about Shakespeare's Henry V. What might playgoers have thought was most interesting that they wanted to see more of, that the marketplace could sustain and would be an attractive financial proposition for the Admiral's Men.
Now, none of these plays that we've been talking about yet are, they were perhaps performed by the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare's company, but they weren't actually by Shakespeare himself. But Shakespeare nerds might be familiar with the titles of two famously lost plays, Love's Labour's Won and Cardenio. What do we know about these two, and how do they serve as an example of the sorts of works that you're writing about in this book?
Well, one of the other things I'm really keen to do in this book and in my work more generally is to be really upfront, honest, transparent about the limits of what we can argue and what we can know. Because I think there's this critical fallacy of being overly confident and asserting where we really need argumentation instead. And it's not always comfortable to admit we don't know things and to acknowledge how flimsy the foundation of our arguments are. And we have to do our best with what we've got. We have limited surviving archival. We have to spin a narrative on the basis of that evidence and tell a story to draw a picture of Shakespeare's theatre, and that's fine. But my concern is when you don't acknowledge those huge gaps or the precarity of the evidence, we start to have tenuous conclusions offered as if they were just, irrefutable fact. And I think that's potentially misleading or dangerous. So Love's Labour's 1 is really interesting because I haven't found out anything new really about its subject matter. It's pretty difficult to do that. But we have a lot of information about this play in the sense that Francis Mears, the Elizabethan schoolmaster, who most people may have heard of in the context of his praising of English writers in relation to the giants of classical literature. So he compares Shakespeare to Plautus in terms of the best for our comedy and things like that. He singles out Love's Labour's 1 as being one of our best English comedies. So getting back to your very first question, why do plays become lost? Is it just because the good ones survive, the bad ones don't? Well, patently not, because here's a play by Shakespeare singled out as one of the best of our comedies, and it became lost. We then know that around 1603 or so, there was a booksellers list that features this play as well. So it seems as if Love's Labour's 1 was not only written and performed for Francis Mears to have seen it performed and to judge it one of our best comedies, it was also printed. And if it appeared in quarto format, in the cheap print format, the single play format that was popular at the time, there probably would have been about 500 copies of Love's Labour's 1 in circulation. It's not uncommon for all 500 to have perished entirely. There's only one first edition of Titus Andronicus, which didn't turn up until the early 1900s in a Swedish attic of all places. And of course, famously, the first edition of Hamlet, the first quarto of Hamlet, didn't turn up until the 19th century, and there's now only 2 copies of that. There's only a single page from memory of the first edition of 1 Henry IV. So each of these plays had 500 copies at one point, and they've all whittled away, probably through being read to pieces, being so popular, not through disregard or neglect as such. But that's quite interesting again. So it was printed, sole authored by a celebrity playwright by modern standards, Shakespeare, who was with a stable company. He didn't change allegiances as such, so there's no interference in terms of company ownership. It wasn't collaboratively authored. It was singled out for praise. So everything says this play should have survived, and yet it didn't. So it's a really salient reminder of the reasons or our lack of understanding for the reasons why things become lost. Cardenio is quite different. Cardenio suffers almost the opposite fate in some ways. This is a play that was produced at court in 1612 to 13. It was written by John Fletcher, who goes on to become the chief dramatist of the King's Men in collaboration with Shakespeare. Shakespeare seems to have had the junior part in that collaborative endeavour at that point. And from what we can tell, Cardenio is based on a subplot or a subsection of Cervantes' Don Quixote. So this amazing moment where the greatest Spanish writer meets the greatest English writer, and we don't have that text. But we do know that in the interregnum, in the middle of the 17th century, when the Puritans succeed in closing the public theatres for a couple of decades almost, one publisher, Humphrey Moseley, had a manuscript of Cardenio, and he intended to publish it, but never did. The play perhaps was then performed in the Restoration, because by 1727, the great Shakespeare editor, Lewis Tybald, claims he had 3 copies of a manuscript of an old Shakespeare play. He doesn't name it, but the story corresponds in all points to the Cardenio story from Cervantes. And Tybald then works it over himself and rewrites it as a play called Double Falsehood. So Double Falsehood exists, and it's an 18th century adaptation of a Restoration adaptation of a 1612-13 collaboration of an adaptation of a Spanish novel, right? It's layers and layers of remove. So it's over-papered in some ways. There's a lot of textual evidence for this lost Shakespeare play, but that doesn't bring us much closer to knowing what exactly Shakespeare wrote, because it's such a remove, really. So the work I was doing was trying to put all that to one side, because that's potentially a red herring in as much as it's been adapted so very much and distorted. The one thing we really know about Tybald's play is that it's not Shakespeare's. It's a massively reworked thing. So instead, I went back to Cervantes and had a look at the story there, imagined I was a dramatist in 1612 or 13. What could I do with this source material? Why would this be an attractive proposition to dramatize, to turn into something for the English stage? And that was quite interesting, because Cardenio, when we restore it to its own context, its own repertorial context, we can see a number of points of correspondence to other plays being offered that season. It's got a premise of tragic love. It has the seeming death but unexpected survival of a woman called Lucinda after she's been coerced into marriage. It has this seemingly made-for-stage business of Cardenio hiding behind a tapestry and misconstruing the events that he witnesses. We have a double exile of Cardenio and Dorothea to live amongst the shepherds. So again, think about those late Shakespeare plays, those pastoral plays, the romances. There's a self-imposed exile of Lucinda who takes herself off to a nunnery. And there's a spectacular recognition scene at the end that reunites four disguised lovers with their rightful partners. So there's lots of elements of this story that I'm sure an English dramatist looking at this would go, oh yeah, this is just, it's handed to me on a plate. This is ready to make money with, right? This is exactly the kind of thing we love doing. And even that season at court, this play was performed in conjunction with Shakespeare's Much Ado, which, is quite an old play by that point in time. It's almost 15 years old. But Much Ado also has a loosely Spanish setting. It's a comedy that looks like it's going to slide into tragedy with Claudio's awful treatment of Hero, but it ends instead with multiple marriages and a miraculous resurrection, a bit like The Winter's Tale for that matter, all of which tallies with the Cardenio story too. So a number of points of correspondence that encouraged me to see a certain logic to the programming, I guess, and to appreciate the value that a Cardenio play could have had for the King's Men at that point in time.
There's this term that keeps coming up in your book, repertory studies. I'm wondering if you might explain, for those of us who aren't as familiar with the term, what is that?
So repertory studies is something that I guess originated with a guy called Bernard Beckerman in the 1960s, but really took off with Rosalind Knutsen's work in the 1990s. And repertory studies is a focus on an individual company's repertory of plays rather than a focus on a particular author as such. So it still recognizes that playwrights contributed these plays, of course, but it decenters them somewhat. It focuses on playing company first and foremost, and it thinks about plays not just as literary artifacts or even masterpieces in some cases, but rather as the basic commodity used for commerce. So each company had to have a number of plays in their repertory to remain financially viable. I mentioned before that playing takes place about 6 days a week, and there are multiple companies throughout London, all competing for what's essentially a fixed pool of play-going public. I mean, London's a large city at the turn of the century. I think I've read it's about 100,000 people, which is relatively large at that point in time, but it's still a fixed pool. And so you have to do something to attract those same playgoers back to your venue and to pay money to your company. So repertory studies examines the underlying logic by which companies choose to acquire certain plays. It thinks about whether they want to duplicate successful offerings from their rival companies or successful offerings that they've had themselves, whether it wants to complement those with having spin-off plays. So thinking in more recent terms of, Joey from Friends or Frasier from Cheers having their own spin-off shows. This happened in the early modern period too, where a particularly memorable or likable character ended up in a story of their own that's quite removed from what happened originally. By the way, that's one of my theories, that Love's Labour's Won may fit into that category, because the one thing we can work out from that title is it's really straining to call attention to a relationship to Love's Labour's Lost, obviously, but you don't win Labour's. Like the title, if you pause and think about Love's Labour's Won for a second, it doesn't make any sense. So it seems like a commercial strategy to just try and engage with that earlier play as a kind of spin-off. And to that extent, I have posited that it's potentially an unplanned sequel. This is something that happens quite a bit, actually. Marlowe's Tamburlaine play is probably the most famous example. Tamburlaine Part 2 starts off with an acknowledgement that the author has felt compelled to pen the second part because of the success, the unexpected success of Part 1. And that's largely what happened with 2 Henry IV as well, where if you look at the source material available to Shakespeare, he's pretty much exhausted the narrative arc for the Prince Hal character in Part 1, and most of the historical material as well. So you've got the prodigal son legend, and you've got the historical events, and they both come to a natural conclusion at the end of 1 Henry IV, and then he feels compelled to write a second part, and he tries to repeat the same character arc, but he's got less historical subject matter to play with, and it just seems to be more of the same. So I did wonder whether Love's Labour's Won is that kind of a thing, where it's an unplanned sequel and maybe Shakespeare just picks 1 or 2 characters from Love's Labour's Lost and creates a spin-off for them. So repertory studies is focusing on the commercial interaction with all the different companies. And that really helps us understand how the plays fit together. And that's one of the reasons why, from my point of view, it sort of doesn't matter if we don't have the text, the play script itself. We can still write and learn lots about how these plays worked on the basis of their subject matter, their genre, whether it was a multi-part play or a single one-off play, what sort of subject matter, what kind of storyline it has, what kind of characters it has, all those sort of features helps us appreciate its place in the repertories of the commercial companies.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in our discussion, you mentioned sort of the metaphor of a puzzle. And throughout the book, you keep talking about basically one of those kind of like visual illusions where you look at a picture and is it a vase or is it two different figures looking at each other? And you kind of use that as this metaphor of, there's the background and there's the figure. It doesn't make sense. The one doesn't make sense without the other.
Mm.
The thing that is the figure doesn't make sense without the background. Kind of going off of that, what do you get if you're sort of looking at the repertory of a company and you start to factor in all those lost plays, even if, as you just said, we don't have the text? But what does that add? What does it add in terms of another puzzle piece?
So the significant challenge that Shakespeare scholars face is that Shakespeare has been so universally praised and lauded for a number of centuries now. I'm not saying without merit. He's clearly got artistic talents. I'm not trying to criticize Shakespeare. In fact, if anything, the attention to his commercial success augments, extends, complements that artistic success. I think it helps us see him as being an even greater writer in many ways. But he has been singled out. And that has produced a certain distortion of the field or a certain bias within the field, I suppose, to the point where in the early 20th century, someone like A.C. Bradley could write a book about Shakespearean tragedy and singled out the four big Shakespeare tragedies, Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, and Othello, and used them to extrapolate rules for what tragedy looked like at that point in time, right? But Shakespeare is just one writer, and his version of tragedy isn't the same that everyone else used. But if we follow his career, if we look at the way he starts off, we think with comedies and histories, and then builds up to tragedies around the turn of the century, and then ends his career with these tragicomedy romances. His version of those genres and that order of trajectory there aren't universal. And so we are distorting Elizabethan drama, early modern drama, if we assume that everyone was doing the same thing or that Shakespeare is representative. And one of the salient things about those figures you quoted earlier, about only 543 plays surviving from the commercial theatre, when we know that the majority have been lost, at least 744 are identifiably lost, and hundreds more than that have sunk without a trace, is that what we're dealing with surviving drama is the distinct minority. So if you want to build an argument based on a minority evidence, you're going to be prone to distortions or errors or potential catastrophes, really. And within that minority of 543, Shakespeare is a further outlier in that only two of his plays that we know of have been lost. Most of them have survived, thanks largely to that publication of the first folio. And the mere fact of such a high survival rate of his plays makes them statistically atypical. They are not representative in that regard. So it's very dangerous building arguments based on Shakespeare if we take him to be typical in that sense. So instead, we need to think about how his plays were quite different to other offerings at that point in time. And for example, his history plays through the 1590s are all largely Tudor history plays. Wars of the Roses, things that culminate in Elizabeth as the current monarch on the throne. Whereas we look at the Admiral's Men, they invested quite heavily in French and continental history plays. They looked at classical history plays. They looked at legendary British plays as well. So King Arthur and that sort of legendary period of the British history. Things that are satisfying a similar need in terms of the marketplace as history plays, but weren't really the same territory as what Shakespeare was doing. So the visual image I use in the book, the Rubens vase image that you mentioned before, is quite different from, say, the duck rabbit image that some people might know of, where you look at it one way, it's a duck, the other way, it's a rabbit, but it's still the same thing you're looking at either way. You just can't work out what it is. Rubens vase features two distinct elements, a background and a foreground, and the way they interrelate, and whether you prioritize the background as the focal image, in which case you see two faces, or you prioritize the foreground as the image, in which case you see the vase or the goblet, will make a difference to what you think the picture is. And so my argument is that Shakespeare, because he's been more knowable and because he's more dominant and we've been cued to focus on his work, is the vase or the goblet. He's the foreground. He's the thing that we hone in on and we focus on, we look at, to the point where we don't even notice the background at all. But the vase is only possible because the background has given it shape. And so it's that interrelationship that's really important here. And looking at the lost plays means looking at those two faces that look at each other and give shape to the vase, and understanding how the lost plays are related to the surviving plays and thinking about how it changes our perception. So one example I gave in the book was thinking about Hamlet. And Hamlet has been singled out amongst Shakespeare's plays is probably the greatest, and one of the most forward-looking plays that anticipate modernity, individual subjectivity, the subconscious, all sorts of advanced things. This sort of maps onto the critical tendency to call this period the early modern period, anticipating modernity rather than the Renaissance, which is what Shakespeare thought of it as rebirthing the classics and looking backwards to origins instead. Hamlet, proto-modern, forward-looking, and I'm suggesting that maybe it's more embedded in the past in the repertory than we've thought of. And if we look at other plays from the 1590s, there's actually a number of lost plays that are set in Denmark. So my question is, what did the average playgoer in Shakespeare's time think about Denmark? And what did they understand Denmark to mean on the stage before they came along and saw Hamlet for the first time? Because Hamlet is the only Shakespeare play set in Denmark, but it's not the only play set in Denmark. So recovering that lost context helps us to sort of retrace those boundaries, I guess, between those two images, the background and the foreground, and better appreciate where Shakespeare sits in that bigger picture.
One thing that's kind of striking too, sort of thinking about this larger context, I'm wondering if we can learn anything from this about kind of what playgoing, what audiences were like back then. You just mentioned, there's a bunch of plays at the time in the 1590s about Denmark. Were people going to see a bunch of plays on the same topic? Were theater companies chasing these hot trends?
They often did seem to be. So one of the ways we know about this, unfortunately it's not for Shakespeare's company, but at the Rose Playhouse, the theatrical impresario who managed that theatre, Philip Henslow, maintained a partially surviving record or diary of which plays were performed on which days of the week and how much money is associated with their box office takings. There's a lot we don't know about Henslow's record keeping. We don't know whether the amounts of money he records represent how much money the play made, how much money was the actors or the company's share of it, how much money Henslow maybe had to pay the company. We don't know, but it's consistent. And that means we can compare. So we can look at a high amount for one play versus a low amount for another play, and we can work out that this play performed better financially than the other. One thing I can do there, by the way, is to work out that Lost Plays consistently performed as well as or better than the plays that survived. So again, there's that furphy that they were poor performers at the box office. It's just not true. Right? They demonstrably earned their keep. So yes, there were trends. Looking at Henslow's diary, we can see a number of plays being re-performed. It's incredibly rare for a single play to perform 2 days in a row during this period, but companies seem to circle back to the same plays. Having invested in them once, having bought the play text from a playwright, usually at a cost of about £4 or £6, which is a not unsubstantial amount, they would then perform that play a few times. And if it was performing well, they would keep on performing it. Why they kept on performing it is something we don't entirely know in one sense. Obviously, there's a financial imperative. If it's making a lot of money, sure. But Marlowe's plays, for example, simply weren't making that much money, as Holger Syme has shown. They did initially, and then there's a very long tail. They kept being performed for another 5 years or so where they were barely earning money or they were losing money altogether. And it seems that the reason for continuing to perform Marlowe's plays is more of a prestige thing or an identity thing. We're the company that owns Tamburlaine, so we'll keep performing that. That's something we can do that no one else can do, even if it's not making money anymore. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons. And examining Henslow's accounts can help identify patterns or trends like the ones you're suggesting before. With Denmark, the thing that I found really interesting was that the stories there all seem to focus on historical accounts, and almost all of them seem to focus on history of Denmark as it relates to the history of England. And if you think back to Viking times, of course, there is a very close relationship between England and Denmark, to the point where Danish kings ruled England briefly as well, and England had to pay a tribute, an annual taxation to Denmark as well. And so the coupling of the English monarchy and the Danish monarchy for a long time makes Denmark an ideal site for exploring English concerns at a step of removal for Shakespeare's audience, if you like. And, Shakespeare does this all the time. You think about Romeo and Juliet, nominally set in Catholic Verona, because it's distant and, it's in the past and it's Catholic and foreign, and they do things there that we wouldn't dream of doing here in Elizabethan London. But of course, it really is about Elizabethan London, right? So Denmark offers you the same opportunity. It's a way of talking about England without setting a play in England. And so when we get to Hamlet at the end of the century, we've had a decade or more of this tradition of, we're set in Denmark. Okay, that's really an English history play. And then we got to see everything, the anxieties of succession and so forth being played out in Shakespeare's Hamlet are very much we've been cued to understand their relevance to English political concerns by the end of the century.
Now, this book grows out of some work you've been doing for quite some time with Lost Plays, and I wondered if you might just tell us about the Lost Plays database. How do people who might be interested in this, where can they find it? How can they use it?
Yeah, sure. So the Lost Plays database was something that emerged actually when I was a PhD student, and I was doing my doctoral thesis on travel plays. And the thing that struck me then that was so fascinating was that the travel plays that have survived, so thinking about The Tempest or maybe even Eastward Ho by Johnson and Marston and Chapman, those plays were either comedies or romances or satires or something completely fantastical. They were very rarely, there are a couple of examples, they were very rarely steeped in recent history. But you look at the lost plays about travel from this period. There's a play called The New World's Tragedy, another one called The Conquest of the West Indies, another one called The Plantation at Virginia, another one about the Amboina Massacre in Indonesia. Many of these lost plays seem to be dramatizing recent historical events. And so attending to lost plays radically transforms our perception of that entire genre of travel plays. It's a necessary corrective that helps us recalibrate our expectations of what such plays would look like and what an early modern audience might be expecting when they went to the playhouse, which in turn I hope helps us then rethink things like The Tempest through that lens. So I was looking at those kinds of lost plays, and I started speaking to Rosalind Knudsen, who I mentioned before in terms of repertory studies, and she knew quite a bit about other lost plays, like the Sir John Mandeville lost play. And Mandeville, if listeners don't know, is that famous medieval traveller who apparently had seen the entire world and all those strange creatures that Othello describes with, the men whose heads do grow beneath their breasts and stuff like that. But of course, he hadn't really travelled anywhere. He'd just gone to his local library and plagiarised notoriously from existing travel accounts. But the question remained of, what would this look like as a play? Like, how would you possibly dramatise this? And so Ros had some information about that, which she kindly shared, and I had some information about another lost play that she didn't know about that I shared in response. And we realised we need to start formalising this exchange of snippets of information, because the thing with lost plays is they're largely invisible in the scholarship up until then. People, for the reasons I outlined before, didn't pay much attention to them or didn't know what to do with them. Often they didn't have names, so they appeared in footnotes, if at all, and rarely in indexes, and almost never as the subject of entire chapters or books, which made it very difficult to put together all the information that had been compiled, and that sum of knowledge. So the Lost Plays database is a wiki. We use the same software that Wikipedia uses, both in terms of longevity, because I figure as much as anything on the internet is permanent, Wikipedia will always be around, so may as well hitch our wagon to that star, right? But also in terms of it being open access, which is very important to us. This is not a money-making operation. This is about making this information, this scholarship, and these historical records publicly available freely for people to use and to engage with. It started off life at the University of Melbourne, where we had final semester IT students choose this as their industry project. I put out my needs and they responded and said, yes, we'd like to do this as a project. So they set up the prototype for me, which is fabulous. And then since 2018, it's been hosted by the Folger Shakespeare Library. So your listeners can now find it at lostplays.folger.edu, or they can Google it, of course. And when they get there, they'll see something that's vaguely familiar in terms of the Wikipedia layout, but it's all about lost plays, obviously. The thing about a wiki is that it doesn't, in fact, it resists a kind of a linear browsing. You don't go from A to B. The creators of the site don't curate it such that there's only one path through it. It's really more of a choose your own adventure. So on the left-hand menu, you'll see the options of browsing this wiki in terms of the years or dates, the play titles, the dramatists who wrote these plays, something called auspices, which refers to the company or the venues at which these lost plays were once performed, as well as category tags too. So if you knew a lost play title like Cardenio, you could go to the play titles section and look that up, and then you'd read the whole entry there. And what we do with the entries is we actually have, it's a bit subtle, but it's always there. There's a template, there's a hierarchy of evidence. The first thing you'll encounter will be the hard facts, if you like, the data, the historical records, which we either transcribe and link to the catalogue entry or a digital source, or we actually digitize them ourselves for the first time. A lot of the site has been invested in digitizing records and making those digital facsimiles available so that you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the document yourself and interpret it how you will, because it's all about just objectively presenting that evidence that you can then work with. We then progressed to listing what is known about the genre and authorship and the affiliation of that play with various companies and playhouses, and sort of summarizing what is the status quo of our knowledge there, before conjecturing about the possible subject matter. And the rule there is that we always look through something like early English books online, which are digitized masses and masses of books from this period, to try to identify what versions of the subject matter would have been available as potential sources to a dramatist who's interested. So we don't want to be anachronistic. We don't want to pull out a 19th century account that Shakespeare could never have known. We look at what was available to Shakespeare and his contemporaries, what might they have used, so we can work out that at a minimum they could have been familiar with this. Let's use that as the basis for what a play could have been like, and sort of draw attention to why this could be an interesting play. And then we collect all the scholarship that's been written about it, so that you don't have to be searching through all those footnotes and where have you. It's all there in the one place. The idea being that the sum is greater than its parts, and we provided that for convenience. And then, as I say, it is a database. It is there for you to use that data and to do what you want with it, to build your own scholarship, your own arguments out of those building blocks, essentially. And I've come to the point now, actually, where what I do when I'm writing a new article or a chapter or whatever is to create those entries for the relevant lost plays as my raw data and post them, and then use that to build my argument. So I wrote an article about Robert Wilson for Helen Ostovich and the Three Ladies of London conference she did at McMaster a few years ago, where it looked at Wilson's entire career. There's only a few of his plays have survived, but quite a lot were lost. And so by writing up all those lost plays, I was able to reshape our understanding of what he looked like as a playwright, paying more attention to the kinds of things he was interested in writing about, which turns out weren't the same as what has survived by that playwright. So it's an interesting restorative or corrective, I guess, in that sense. So one of my favorite things of those entries, actually, is the number of world-class libraries around the world who have contributed freely, in most instances, their historical records to the database. So we've been able to digitize a number of invaluable plots, backstage plots, for example. These are essentially a roadmap for a play. It's a sheet of paper hung backstage that describes scene by scene which actors are required on stage and what characters they play, sometimes what special effects are needed. These are incredible documents. Only 6 or so survive. We've digitized all of those now for the Lost Plays database. You can have a look at those. They're from the British Library and from Dulwich College. And there are a number of other historical records in terms of diary entries or stationers register entries and licensing records have digitized. And possibly one of my favorite things is there are a number of examples of musical fragments that have survived from plays that are otherwise lost. In particular, there are entire songs from 3 different plays. One is Cardenio, one is a play by Turner called The Nobleman, and another play is by Massenger and a couple of others in the King's Men called The Jeweller of Amsterdam. And each of those 3 songs we've had professionally recorded by musicians who specialize in using modern recreations of historical instruments. So you can actually hear a lost play if you look at the entries for those 3 plays in particular, and you can feel what it was like to be at a playhouse listening to a play in performance. The Cardenio play has lyrics, which is interesting. The other 2 are just music, but you can get the atmosphere of being at the play. And again, this is one of those things of a collaborative enterprise like the Lost Plays database. I'm not a music scholar. I can appreciate that and enjoy that. I'm probably not going to write about those 3 songs because I lack the expertise to talk about the technicalities, but someone else will. And I hope they do. I hope they go and listen to those pieces and then start giving me new insights into why this particular kind of melody was chosen, or this key and these notes were chosen, what's significant about this tempo, all sorts of things that they can come at and with their expertise, and collaboratively we come at something that's much better than any of us could individually achieve.
We'll post links in our show notes that will let you explore the world of lost early modern English plays, as well as information about David's book, Shakespeare and Lost Plays. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mike. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled Theatre in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.